Railroad.
As with most new technologies, investors loved railroads at the beginning because there was all the sunny promise and none of the ugly realities, because none of the railroads had run a railroad yet. And so there was a great boom in railroad stocks in the 1830s.
The railroad proved itself quickly, and railroads began spreading like a spider web across the United States.
It's hard to imagine modern America without the railroads from the 19th century, because not only did it physically stitch the country together as one economic and geographical unit, but it created the modern financial markets. In order to raise money for the railroads, the banking system developed and the sales of securities developed in a way that we're still operating out of the fundamental principles that were set up.
A journalist of the time described the powerful effects of the railroad on Wall Street.
The mania seemed to possess everybody. Old-fashioned merchants abandoned the principles of a lifetime and took a flyer, or in other words, bought a few hundred shares of Erie. Even the fair sex, practically asserting women's rights under the cover of a broker, dabbled in Erie shares.
Well, the railroads just came to dominate the entire U.S. stock market by the middle of the 19th century onwards. Was mainly a railroad market. The other stuff was peripheral.
In 1844, the first great revolution in communications hit Wall Street. Those simple dots and dashes of the telegraph. It's hard to imagine today just how primitive communication was then.
Well, a financial market can never be larger than the area within which communication is effectively instant, because everybody in the market has to know what the current prices are.
Outside Manhattan, the demand for the latest Wall Street information led to some bizarre schemes.
They're so anxious were people to get current prices that they actually established a semaphore line between New York and Philadelphia.
They positioned people every 6 to 8 miles on tall buildings or hilltops with a telescope and a semaphore flag, and someone from the merchants atop the Merchants Exchange would begin with the list and using various configurations of the flag, transmit the prices to the next person stationed in Jersey City, and so on, all the way to Philadelphia. And that way the market news could reach Philadelphia in about 30 minutes.
But the telegraph cut that time to seconds.
The telegraph was immediately important because it could convey information at the speed of light over vast distances. And therefore people who had used to trade in Boston or Philadelphia or Baltimore could now trade in New York and get better prices. And so Wall Street very quickly, within 10 years, became not only the largest financial securities market in the United States, but essentially the only one.
Side by side, the telegraph and the railroads were opening the vast American West, and Wall Street was financing it.
Well, it appeals to investors because potentially it can all be settled. Then if it's settled, people have to be able to get there, and people have to be able to send their goods to market. Well, who's going to pay for it? Wall Street is going to pay for it, and Wall Street is going to profit by paying for it. You know, they're the ones who have the capital to open this all up in the hopes that they will reap the rewards.
Soon, Wall Street received more good news about the American West. Gold in California. By 1849, word of the gold strike reached the East Coast.
The reaction was essentially a riot. I mean, 80,000 people left the eastern seaboard and traveled to California. Same number the following year. It affected Wall Street by adding enormously to the American money supply, because in the mid-19th century, the money supply was defined by gold. I mean, the world was essentially on the gold standard since the Bank of England had gone on that standard in 1821.
But Wall Street's great booms were followed by devastating busts. It was a cycle that afflicted the economy for the entire 19th century. Investor George Francis Train offered this wry comment on the wild speculation brought about by the new technologies.
Monday, I started my land operations. Tuesday, owed millions by all calculations. Wednesday, my brownstone palace began. Thursday, I drove out a spanking new span. Friday, I gave a magnificent ball. Saturday, smashed with just nothing at all.
The U.S. was the emerging market of the 19th century. It's hard to remember that now because we're so used to America being so much the dominant economic power in the world. But it was very fragile at that time, the economy, and the gyrations that Wall Street went through with wild speculation, terrible bankruptcies, panics, depressions, and crashes. It was really cowboy capitalism. It was completely chaotic. There were hucksters under every tree, and the honest businessmen and good railroads were hard to find.
America would have a much more agonizing problem as the country tore itself apart. When we come back, the Civil War on Wall Street and the golden age of stock manipulators.
The only rule on Wall Street in the Civil War era was caveat emptor, let the buyer beware.